Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest. But before I do that, here's a quote that I picked just for this episode. It is impossible to suffer without making someone pay for it. Every complaint already contains revenge. Friedrich Nietzsche. Our dear friend Brian Hess is back to talk about part two, the value of conflict. Brian, the founder of the Pavement Group, top contracting school, mentor, role model to those who want to win and win big. One team, one dream. Here we are. Follow our journey, join our mission. I'm going to repeat that quote. It is impossible to suffer without making someone pay for it. Every complaint already contains revenge. Brian, thanks for coming back.
My pleasure, man. Always a pleasure to spend any amount of time with you. However long this goes. Sometimes they're 20, sometimes they're 2 hours. You never know.
Today is 12. I tell you. What role can a leader play in conflict?
I think the leader, is the example of conflict, whether they realize it or not. And that's probably the most important part of understanding conflict. I've been part of organizations where the leader was overly excited about conflict, right? Like, almost looking for it everywhere, picking fights would be a good way to describe it, right? And then I've been part of organizations where, the leader avoided conflict at all costs, and that's neither one of those is probably the way to do it. It's more in the lines of, setting the example as a leader of how you deal with conflict, right? How you deal with, those that disagree with you really demonstrates who you are. I think it's a great, introduction to yourself to really analyze that, how do you? And I am a person that's grown tremendously in this because, I don't think that we all have great examples in our lives of how to deal with conflict, right? Sometimes we're raised in environments where maybe somebody just doesn't have a lot of conflict in their family, right? Or maybe it's avoided, or maybe, they sweep it under the rug, or whatever the case is. And so, when you don't see a lot of conflict being dealt with, then you don't really know how to deal with it yourself, And so for me, that was the case for a large portion of my life. And, you have helped me tremendously just be able to see the value of that. And as in this important part for the listeners, how do you teach somebody to handle conflict? Well, the first thing you have to do is introduce them to how to do it, how to embrace it. And then once they see the massive benefits from conflict and dealing with it the right way, they will find their own way through how to mold conflict into their own personality, right? And I think it's super important to just get somebody to lean into it so that they can feel the benefits from the resolution that comes from embracing it. And when they do, they'll never look back, and their life will be changed. Their business will be changed. Everything will get better as a result of their ability to embrace and lean into conflict.
When you mentioned that the example of those that sought it and then those that avoided it, I think of like a victim bully dichotomy.
Yep.
What are some of the ways that the listener can recognize if they are falling into either of those?
Well, I think that this is probably a more complex answer than what the listeners would look for, but it's important to survey those around you. How do those people, we've had this discussion before. You got to try really hard to get people to tell you, what's going on and how they really feel, especially depending on your position of leadership. The higher you get in leadership, the more success you have, the less likely it is that people actually tell you about yourself. And so I would say surveying the people. I would also say, like, how open conversations are around you is a good indication. It's are people, a one on the victim side would be, is everybody bringing their victim comments to you, their victim positions to you? Because if they are bringing their positions of victimhood to you, it's probably likely that you are one as well. People don't generally bring victim statements to people that they don't think will receive them. The same is true with bullying, right? If somebody is, bringing you all the problems so that you can go, hammer on people as a leader, then it's probably an indicator that you're the person that people look at as the hammer. And so, dealing with issues in either of those scenarios is a really bad situation for a leader. And so, kind of taking the score of what kind of conversations are people having with you. And if they fall into those two buckets, then you may fall into one of those two buckets as well. Sometimes people can be both, by the way.
What do you mean?
It could be a bully and a victim, right? On one hand, they're hammering on people, and on the other hand, something happens and they want all the sympathy, and they become a victim, and then they create all the dynamic of the culture of, like, everybody has to take care of them because something bad happened, and they want to be the center of attention because something bad happened and they want people to lift them back up.
How can one work on that?
Well, I think it's a long process. It takes education, it takes mentorship, it takes, real experience. I think the one thing that I learned about conflict is the quote is, conflict delayed is conflict multiplied, right? And I think that as we understand the value of dealing with conflict swiftly, we start to understand the real value of getting our own time back, the distraction mentally that happens when we have something to deal with that we delay. I find that so often that's conflict, right? The things that we procrastinate, there's many times that list is full of things that are rooted in the avoidance of conflict. I think it's pushing yourself to deal with it swiftly so that you can give the other person their time back and yours. And I've learned that the speed of business is multiplied by your ability to deal with those types of conflicts swiftly. Now there's always a caveat to that sometimes it's not the best time right in the moment to deal with something, right? And so that's a judgment call. It's, is something going on that's beyond just the situation. Sometimes people have personal things going on that are attached to the conflict, and it's a really bad time to address something. But as a whole, I've learned that dealing with conflict swiftly is always the best, right? It's to just get to the root of the problem, check your emotions, right? Just ask a lot of questions, be inquisitive. And if you do a really good job, as you do this over and over and over again, if you ask the right questions, people actually work themselves through the conflict, right? They'll start to come to the realizations of what's happening themselves. And that's the most powerful, right? When somebody is self-educating through a guide, walking them through what the scenario is, or helping them discover it on their own, as opposed to you as the leader telling them what the issue is. And so that's a skill that I'm still working on all the time, trying to get better at, but it's been the most powerful is allowing people to realize what's happening on their own through inquiry, through asking the right questions. And
why do you think that helps the person?
Well, in general, it's learning instead of being managed, right? Or told what to do. People are way more excited to learn. It feels like a partnership as opposed to a dictatorship, right? When you're sitting down and having conversation with people, and, you know, trying to get to the root of the problem. Many times you uncover things that you didn't even know also through the inquiry. And that is, that's super powerful as well. But it demonstrates caring. It demonstrates leadership. It demonstrates what people look for in leadership. You know, I always say, you know, you want to be the steady hand for people when things are wrong. Many times when there's conflict happening, what I've found is that the way that conflict is shouldered, it reduces as you increase in experience and leadership and level within an organization. So like, you know, the leader, you know, in my position, the CEO is going to take that conflict differently than the person, you know, in the middle of the organizational chart. That person's going to carry that much heavier, right? And then the line level is going to carry that extremely heavy sometimes. And so, you know, dealing with that swiftly allows people to process it better and not be unproductive thinking about this issue that exists, instead of, you know, being able to thrive in their gifts and do what's needed to produce results in a company. And so I think it's our responsibility as a leader to address those things and to get to things quickly. It's also our responsibility to be an example of how that works, because how we deal with conflict opens the door to how it will be dealt with by other people within the organization. You know, do we offer grace or do we not? Right. And by the way, sometimes grace can be taken out of context, right? Sometimes grace can just be, you know, an excuse for somebody not doing what they say they're, you know, what they should be doing. And we say, oh, we're giving them grace. Well, it's, you know, sometimes that's just an excuse to avoid conflict. But if we embrace conflict and then we offer people, you know, a new path in a new direction, we encourage them to grow from the experience of whatever, you know, may have happened, then we build a more open culture and we build a more open company. And in my experience doing that, it has multiplied our ability to get results.
Yeah. What are the results of, you know, yeah. What are the results?
Well, I think the results are you get people's gifts a lot more if you have openness, if you have people that feel comfortable being themselves, because they understand that, you know, if something goes wrong, that conflict's going to be dealt with in a way that's, you know, respectful and not, you know, we're not shaming people. And we encourage people to push the limits. And so we have to expect mistakes to happen. We have to expect, you know, things to not go well. You know, we've talked about this recently. It's like when we're trying to do 100 things, instead of, you know, let's say that the average company does 25 things at a time, we're trying to do 100. You know, we have to expect some imperfection. And so, you know, what is better? In my experience, it's, you know, let's try to get there. Let's try to work hard to multiply the results and shrink the time that we can actually do something. And so the results are that we've been able to do that as a company, right? We've accomplished in 5.5 years what normally takes, you know, in some cases, decades. Some people never get there. And we've done that through being accepting of imperfection. And that's hard, by the way, for some people, you know, especially I've found on the operations side of the business, you know, the operations mind is a little bit different than the sales / entrepreneur mind. And so, you know, we have to help those people become comfortable with imperfection, because that's their biggest rub is that they like things organized and they like things, you know, black and white and checking boxes. And sometimes when we're going fast, there's a lot of conflict there because of personality and the way that their side of the business runs, and then the overarching organization trying to, you know, knock that off the rails, right? And so we have to have grace there, and we have to help those people, you know, kind of come our direction a little bit. We have to go theirs, right? And then find middle ground with people all the time. And that's something that we've been able to do as an organization. It's one of the things that I am most proud of, is our relationship between operations and sales is the best that I've ever had, right? And, that helps move the business forward faster. And so I think, to answer your question directly, like that's the result, is the multiplication of results and the division of time, right? You can shrink time and you can multiply results by embracing conflict in a open, positive, accepting way.
Why is the relationship between sales and ops so important?
Well, that's another, it's the speed of business, right? There have been companies that I've worked for that I would jokingly, refer to the operations department as the sales prevention department, right? And that's something that's not, I don't believe, abnormal in companies these days, because they don't build the culture between those two companies. They allow them to kind of exist in silos. And we have intentionally tried to break down those walls, eliminate those silos, have salespeople taking time to be on the operations call, have operations people taking the time to be on sales calls, and, really cross-training that so that those departments understand what the others are doing, right? For many years, it was like the running joke. I said, operations people, if they're not exposed to sales, they think salespeople are just out taking people to lunch and golfing and, taking people to events. And, the networking part is the front and center thing that people notice the most. They don't notice, the 10 p.m. nights when a salesperson is, updating their notes in the system, the early morning calls, the constant rejection, all that stuff. And so as they get exposed to that, obviously anybody that sees that would be more accepting of the position. And then the salespeople see operations as the people that just, nitpick their work and find all the mistakes and, all that stuff. And so when they coexist in each other's cultures, they understand the why behind the things that happen. And that's an example of the elimination of conflict in the first place. It's like, how do we eliminate that conflict? Well, the easiest way is to show them the human side to both positions, because typically a salesperson is going to go to operations and say like, wow, this is not easy. And I don't want to exist here because it doesn't match my personality. And vice versa is also true. An operations person's like, dude, this is way too much gray and way too much rejection and way too much, bad stuff for me to be able to exist in every day. That's usually the personality of both of those organizations within an organization, right? And so as you get that right, as you introduce those people to each other, they start to understand each other's positions and they become accepting of it. But it's embracing that conflict and overlapping those organizations that really creates the magic.
What role do you think the leadership's ability to have the tough conversations plays in that integration of the sales and ops?
Well, I think it's two things. I think number one, everything is around your ability to embrace and have those difficult conversations, but it's also understanding when you need to remove yourself from those difficult conversations. So what happens a lot, the triangle, right? The ABC triangle of people. And so person C goes to person A with a complaint about person B. And as the leader, if you don't either involve all parties, if you just listen to that and then you go try to figure out what's happening, you create triangulation within your organization. And the more that you can eliminate triangulation and make those people talk to each other, right? Help them be able to talk to each other. And so that usually starts with the leader being part of those conversations. So kind of being the mediator of, those, because people aren't comfortable going to each other because it's not the way society works. It's not the way their families work. And so if we can demonstrate by being the mediator how easy it is to talk to each other and actually get to a resolution and eliminate all those crazy emotions that come with people getting frustrated with each other, then we create the magic within those people that shows them, it demonstrates to them how to deal with conflict themselves. And so what we found is that not just in our own company, but in the companies within Top Contractor School, as we've done this, especially in construction, where it's a heavy family business driven culture, right? Every business is a family business. So that sometimes, depending on the family dynamic, that will reduce people's openness, because the family lack of openness transfers over to the business. But when we create that openness by showing people how to deal with conflict, the resolution starts to happen really fast. And I've seen, family businesses absolutely explode in a positive way because of just removing that triangulation, just teaching people how to talk to each other. So when you're frustrated, when person C is frustrated with person B, they don't need to involve person A unless they can't resolve it directly with person B. And so that's the goal, is to get them to go directly to that person and try to address the issue. Because if we've got systems, we've got processes, we've got expectations, and we also have an expectation of how conflict is handled, then 95% of conflict is going to get handled without the leader even needing to get involved. Those things resolve themselves. They're self-healing. And so we've had a lot of that in our company. And by the way, some people have not been able to do that. They've not been very good at, going from one person directly to the other. They always need help. They always have, something going on that they need help resolving. And in most cases, those people work themselves out of the business because, frankly, a lot of them are more interested in the gossip, or they're more interested in living in conflict than they are actually having resolved conflict. And, hopefully people resolve that in their own lives eventually, but sometimes that's the way that people choose to operate.
In that scenario, if C is a subordinate, B is subordinate, going to A is the authority in that case. Do you think that the A's in the scenario go to B's about C's, or C's about B's without even realizing it in their own organizations?
Absolutely. I think to some degree we all do that, at times, right? Whether that could be the positioning of a conversation that you have. You're sitting in an office or you're walking around an office on a phone call where people can pick up what you're saying, for example, right? Maybe that. It could be a direct conversation where you're just violating the confidentiality and creating gossip in your own organization because you slip and tell somebody something that you're not supposed to, or you do it intentionally, or you're frustrated, or whatever it is. I think most people, if not all, do that from time to time because it's so normal. And the more we reduce that, the faster the business grows. The more we reduce that, the less drama we have to deal with as leaders. The more we reduce that, the more we can hold people to that idea of not gossiping, of going to each other, of not, going and gaining somebody else's support for an issue that they have, and just taking that issue to the right place. That's also a great example of what happens in businesses where employees, will go to other employees about their complaints about the company instead of going to the leader. And so there's a couple situations there that could be the case for the listeners. So number one, maybe they feel like you're unapproachable as a leader. Number two, the opposite of that could be, and I've seen this a lot, like their position on a complaint, they don't believe is strong enough subconsciously to take to the leader. So they want to go gain support other places. Right. So they'll go to another employee to get validated before they go to the leader, before they bring it to the right place. And those things all need to be triaged, whether it's the leader that, is coming across as a person that doesn't want to listen to the team. And again, that could be happening layers down into the organization as well. Maybe somebody is saying to the team, hey, don't bother this person because they're busy. I've heard that one before. Don't bother them with that because they're busy. Well, that it's the leader's job to get bothered, right? And so that can create a culture where people don't feel openness. And so you really, it's a full-time job, man, to make sure that you've got your finger on the pulse of how these things are being resolved. Businesses make money from solving problems, and not just the problem of the product that you sell, but the problems within the culture that exist as a result of life, as a result of living as a human being. And those problems that exist, the better we get as an organization at resolving those conflicts, both within the organization, but also those conflicts that exist for our team members outside of the organization, right, in their personal lives, the more successful we're going to be as a company.
Do you think there's a connection with the success of organizations with the discussion around when the success or failure of organization is somehow correlated to the discussion of the people or of ideas, meaning the discussions are around people versus the discussions or are around ideas? I'm curious, do you think they're correlated? The success or failure of bringing a product or service to market has anything to do with the discussion of the people about people or about ideas?
I absolutely believe that to be true. And I think every organization is going to have people that talk about people and people that talk about ideas, and there's going to be a percentage of time that those things happen. And so if you can get that to 90% of the time talking about ideas and 10% of people, talking about people, I think you're going to win at the highest level. And if you can get it higher than 90-10, it's just going to multiply everything, because that's what we've seen in pockets of our business where we've been focused on the mission, most focused on the mission, and the business is kind of just humming, right? Like there's not a lot of people problems or people challenges. That's where we make the biggest leaps. And so when when it feels heavy and we, culturally things get misaligned, and that happens in every business, that flips it, right? We start talking more about how we can resolve these issues as opposed to how we can solve bigger problems for our clients. And that's the dynamic of business.
It's interesting you bring that up. It makes me think the perfect society that doesn't exist. If you think of that thought experiment, the perfect society that doesn't exist, it's not that they don't have crime. It's how crime is dealt with. It's not that there is freedom for what? Upward mobility, for us to carve our path. But how do we get that? How do we give that freedom without the person that has it just ends up doing whatever the heck they want to destroy their life instead of create a life? And these contradictions they're it's not like there's any place in the world that has a perfect society, but how do we answer these questions and pose these questions and have these? That's what came to mind in this. I drew this you see this 90-10 example. You said 90% talk about ideas, 10% talk about people. And then I wrote versus what is the antithesis of that? Would be like, we talk about people 95% of the time and ideas 10% of the time. It could be like a marker. Is like, are we on the right track with our culture?
It's a great measure. And that would be a great survey to put out to leadership teams to see, what do they think? How would they rate the company based on the last 90 days? How has it been? And then to track those results as a indicator of that, because it's so massively important. And I'm telling you, man, if I go back over the 5.5 years of the Pavement Group's existence, I could point right to it where we've had, challenges on the people side for whatever, reason, things going on in people's lives, people, being misaligned with the mission, all kinds of stuff happening. Right. And, when that happens, the business slows down because it gets heavy, it gets harder to carry, it gets distracted from what's, supposed to be happening in the business. And by the way, that's, when you're talking about society, it's like, well, that's the interesting part of life, isn't it? Is that, everything's perfect until we go out to our car and we drive to the coffee shop today and somebody rear ends us. No fault of our own. but people deal with things. Life is messy. And so that intersection of life and business for people, that is called business culture. That's the intersection. It's where life and business intersects. That little intersection there is culture, and how we deal with that intersection of life and business will define how healthy or unhealthy our culture is.